You're not welcome here this year. Those were the words my daughter-in-law sent me on the morning of Mother's Day, and if you had been standing in my kitchen at that moment, you might have expected tears, or anger, or at the very least a phone call demanding an explanation. But instead, I simply looked at the message glowing on my phone screen, placed the device gently on the kitchen counter, and smiled. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that only comes after decades of living, raising a child, and eventually finding yourself alone in rooms that once felt too small for the noise of a growing family. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across the oak table I had bought more than 30 years earlier, back when my son Daniel was still in middle school and I was working 2 jobs just to keep that table full of food every night. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the same way I did every morning, 2 teaspoons of sugar and a little cream, and sat down slowly in the chair by the window, letting the silence settle around me. The message was still there when I picked up the phone again, short and neat, written with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from someone who believes they hold all the power. Vanessa had always been good at that. Even the first time she stepped into this house, 5 years ago, she carried herself like someone already measuring the walls and windows as if they might one day belong to her. I remember that afternoon clearly. Daniel had brought her over for dinner, smiling the way he used to when he was proud of something, and I had spent the whole day cooking a proper meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic. The kind of dinner that fills a home with warm smells before the doorbell even rings. Vanessa had complimented the food politely, but her eyes had wandered around the room, lingering on the hardwood floors, the wide staircase, the backyard visible through the glass doors. At the time I told myself she was just curious, maybe impressed, maybe imagining what life with Daniel might look like. After all, every young couple dreams about a future. But some people don't dream about building something new. Some people dream about taking over something that already exists. Over the years, little moments began to collect in my memory, like puzzle pieces I didn't fully understand yet. Vanessa asking how long I had owned the house. Vanessa wondering if property taxes were high in this neighborhood. Vanessa once standing in the backyard with her phone, quietly saying, "This land alone must be worth a fortune." I never confronted her about those things. I simply listened, the way mothers do after decades of learning that patience often reveals more truth than confrontation ever could. Daniel changed slowly too, though it took me longer to see it. The weekly phone calls became monthly. Sunday dinners became holidays only. And eventually even those visits began to feel shorter, as if you were always in a hurry to get back somewhere else. I told myself that was normal. People grow up. They build their own families. They become busy. That is the natural rhythm of life in America, where children grow independent and mothers learn to let go. But this morning, staring at that simple message on my phone, I realized something else had been happening quietly for years. Someone had been rewriting the rules of my own family without ever asking me. "You're not welcome here this year." I read the sentence one more time and set the phone down again. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked twice before falling silent. Mother's Day had always meant something to me, not because of gifts or flowers or fancy brunch reservations, but because it reminded me of the years Daniel and I spent building a life together from almost nothing. I remembered the tiny apartment where we lived when he was 6 years old, the leaky faucet I learned to fix myself, the late-night shifts at the hospital laundry room where I folded endless sheets just to make sure he had everything he needed for school. Every mile of that journey had led to this house, this quiet morning, this moment. And yet, strangely enough, I didn't feel angry. Not even hurt. I simply felt certain. Because the truth is, by the time Vanessa sent that message, I had already made a decision that would change everything about the future she thought she was walking into. I finished my coffee slowly, rinsed the mug in the sink, and glanced once more at the sunlight stretching across the table where Daniel used to do his homework. Then I picked up my keys, straightened the collar of my jacket, and walked toward the front door with the calm understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is not a fight, not an argument, but a quiet smile and a plan that no one else sees coming. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, the same way I had done thousands of times over the years, but that morning the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the decision I had already made had quietly removed a weight I had been carrying without noticing. The neighborhood was calm, lined with tall maple trees that had watched this street change decade after decade, families moving in, children growing up, houses being painted and repainted in new colors that tried to hide the passing of time. My blue sedan sat in the driveway exactly where I had parked it the night before. It was not a fancy car, but it was reliable, and after working most of my life, I had learned to appreciate reliability more than appearances. I opened the door, placed my purse carefully on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. The phone in my purse vibrated softly. Another message. I did not need to look to know who it was from. Vanessa had always preferred messages to conversations. Messages gave her control. Messages left no room for interruptions. I opened the phone anyway. The screen showed another short sentence. Daniel agrees with me. We want a quiet celebration this year. I read the words slowly. Daniel agrees with me. For a long time, that would have been the part that hurt the most, because when you spend your life raising a child you believe, perhaps foolishly, that somewhere deep inside that child there will always be a place reserved for you. But the strange thing about growing older is that clarity begins to replace expectation. I had already seen the pattern long before this morning. It had begun subtly, almost politely. Vanessa offering to host holidays. Vanessa suggesting that it might be easier if celebrations happened at their house instead of mine. Vanessa explaining that Daniel had been very busy with work and that it was probably better if I called before visiting. Each change seemed reasonable on its own. Each adjustment felt small. But over time the center of the family slowly shifted away from the house where it had begun. I drove slowly down Maplewood Street, passing the small park where Daniel had learned to ride a bicycle when he was 7 years old. I could still picture that afternoon clearly. He had been terrified at first, gripping the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white, but after a few tries he had finally pushed forward and pedaled straight across the grass while shouting, "Mom, look at me." I had run behind him laughing until I could not catch my breath. For a mother, moments like that stay alive forever. They sit quietly in the corners of memory, waiting to remind you that love is built out of ordinary days. The traffic light at the corner turned red and I stopped, watching a young couple walk across the crosswalk with a stroller. The man leaned down to adjust the blanket while the woman smiled at something the baby did. For a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel and Vanessa would ever have children of their own. Vanessa had mentioned it once or twice in passing, usually in the same conversations where she asked questions about the house. Questions about the mortgage. Questions about property values. Questions about whether I had ever considered downsizing now that I lived alone. At the time I had simply nodded and changed the subject. But questions like that leave echoes behind them. You begin to notice where someone looks first when they enter a room. Some people look at family photographs. Others look at square footage. The light turned green, and I continued driving toward the downtown district where the older brick buildings still stood from the days when this town had been built around a railway station and a flour mill. My destination was only 15 minutes away, a modest office above a bakery that had been selling cinnamon rolls for nearly 40 years. I had visited that office earlier in the week, sitting across from a man who had handled legal documents for half the families in this county. We had spoken calmly for nearly an hour. I had asked careful questions. He had explained every option with the patience of someone who understood that decisions made later in life carry a different kind of weight. By the time I walked out of that office 3 days ago, the future of my house, my savings, and everything I had built over decades was no longer uncertain. Vanessa did not know that yet. Daniel did not know either. As I pulled into the parking lot across from the bakery that morning, the sweet smell of fresh bread drifted through the open car window. Mother's Day brunch would be starting soon at their house across town, a table full of flowers and smiling photographs waiting to be posted online. Vanessa would probably be telling guests how peaceful the day felt without unnecessary complications. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and closed the door gently behind me. Then I walked toward the staircase leading up to the lawyer's office with the steady confidence of someone who had finally decided that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. I stepped into the building and climbed the narrow staircase slowly, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath my shoes, the same quiet sound I had heard 3 days earlier when I first came here to make a decision that most people wait far too long to make. The hallway upstairs smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread drifting up from the bakery below, and for a moment I paused near the window that overlooked Main Street. The town looked peaceful that morning. A few cars moved slowly along the road. A family walked toward the church on the corner. Somewhere a church bell rang once, then faded into the quiet air. Mother's Day always had a way of making the world look softer, as if everyone wanted to believe families were exactly the way greeting cards described them. I adjusted the strap of my purse and walked down the hallway toward the office door with the small brass plate that read Harold Bennett, attorney at law. The door was already open. Inside, the room looked exactly the same as it had earlier that week. Shelves lined with legal books. A wide wooden desk. A framed photograph of a fishing lake hanging on the wall behind his chair. Mr. Bennett looked up from a folder when I stepped inside. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and calm eyes that suggested he had spent many years watching families untangle complicated situations. He offered a polite smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, standing to greet me. "I thought you might come by today." I nodded and sat down in the same chair across from his desk where I had sat 3 days before. The chair was comfortable, the kind that encourages patience rather than urgency. Outside the window behind him, I could see the roof of the bakery and a line of customers already forming along the sidewalk below. "It is a busy morning in town," he said. "I suppose many families are gathering for brunch." I allowed myself a small smile at that. "Yes," I said quietly. "Many families are." He studied my expression for a moment, not with curiosity, but with understanding. People who work in his profession learn quickly that the most important words are often the ones not spoken aloud. He opened a folder on the desk and slid a document gently toward me. "Everything we discussed earlier this week is ready," he said. "We can review it again if you would like." I picked up the papers and read them carefully, even though I already knew what they said. Every sentence was clear. Every clause precise. Years of work, years of savings, every inch of the house on Maplewood Street had now been arranged in a way that protected the future exactly as I believed it should be protected. Some people imagine that decisions like this are made out of anger. But anger is loud and impulsive, and nothing about the quiet morning in that office felt impulsive. What I felt instead was something much steadier. Clarity. I remembered the first time Vanessa had asked about the house, standing in my kitchen while Daniel carried plates to the table. She had touched the edge of the granite counter and said with a thoughtful smile, "This place must be worth quite a lot by now." At the time I had simply shrugged and said that houses are meant to be lived in, not calculated like numbers on a spreadsheet. But over the years I had begun to notice how often that subject returned. Property values. Inheritance laws. The advantages of transferring ownership early. Questions asked casually, always followed by polite laughter as if they were merely part of friendly conversation. I signed the final page slowly and handed the pen back to Mr. Bennett. He placed the documents neatly into the folder and closed it with a quiet tap of his hand. "Everything is official now," he said. "The trust has been established and the will has been updated exactly as you requested. No one will be able to alter it without your consent." I thanked him and stood up, feeling lighter than I had felt in years. As I reached the door, he spoke again, his voice gentle but sincere. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "sometimes people believe kindness means surrender." I turned back toward him and shook my head slightly. "Kindness does not mean surrender," I replied. "It simply means you wait until the right moment to decide who truly deserves it." Outside the office, the hallway seemed brighter than before. I walked down the staircase and stepped back onto Main Street where the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air and families laughed as they carried bakery boxes to their cars. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was probably arranging flowers on a dining table and telling guests how peaceful the day felt without complications. I paused beside my car and looked down the street for a moment before opening the door. The truth was simple now. Vanessa believed she had closed a door this morning when she sent that message telling me I was not welcome. But sometimes when a door closes, it quietly opens another one that leads somewhere far more important. I sat in the car for a moment before turning the key, watching people move along the sidewalks of Main Street as if the entire town had decided to celebrate the same peaceful morning. A young boy ran out of the bakery holding a white box while his father followed behind laughing, and the smell of warm cinnamon drifted through the open window. For a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel had already arrived at Vanessa's house across town. If he was standing in a bright kitchen filled with flowers and brunch dishes while Vanessa greeted guests with the kind of confident smile she always wore when she believed everything was under her control. I imagined the dining table set carefully with matching plates, the phone already positioned somewhere nearby so that photographs could be taken and shared online with cheerful captions about family love. Vanessa had always liked appearances. Appearances told a simple story. They left no room for the quiet truths that lived underneath them. I started the engine and slowly guided the car back onto the street. The drive across town took about 20 minutes if the traffic lights cooperated, and as I passed through the familiar neighborhoods, I found myself remembering the many Mother's Days that had come before this one. When Daniel was a little boy, he used to wake up early and try to cook breakfast by himself. One year, he brought me a plate with 2 pieces of toast that were slightly burned and an egg that had broken apart in the pan. He looked so proud carrying that plate across the kitchen that I ate every bite while he watched with hopeful eyes. Another year, he made a card out of construction paper and drew a picture of the 2 of us standing beside our old apartment building. The drawing had crooked windows and a bright yellow sun above the roof. At the bottom, he had written in careful letters, "Best mom ever." I kept that card for years in a small box where I stored the things mothers never throw away. The light at Oak Street turned red, and I stopped the car, watching the reflection of the sky across the windshield. Life has a strange way of changing the meaning of old memories. What once felt like a simple moment of love can later reveal how easily that love can be redirected by the influence of someone new. When Daniel first told me he had met Vanessa, he sounded excited in a way that made me genuinely happy for him. Every parent wants to see their child build a life with someone who will stand beside them through the years. I invited her to dinner that very week, hoping she would feel welcomed in our home from the beginning. At first, she seemed charming and thoughtful. She complimented the house, admired the garden, and told me she had always hoped to live somewhere quiet like Maplewood Street. I believed her. Looking back now, I realized that belief was part of my own nature. I had spent most of my life assuming people meant what they said. But there were small moments even in those early visits that lingered in my mind long after the conversations ended. Vanessa asking how long I planned to stay in such a large house now that Daniel had moved out. Vanessa mentioning how many young couples would love a property with such a big backyard. Vanessa laughing lightly while saying that homes like this were almost impossible to afford nowadays unless they were inherited. At the time, those comments sounded harmless. They were spoken with polite smiles and followed by quick changes of subject. Yet over the years, the pattern became clearer. Vanessa never asked about the memories inside this house. She asked about the value of the walls. I turned onto Willow Avenue and continued driving toward the other side of town where newer houses lined wider streets. Somewhere in that neighborhood, Vanessa was hosting the celebration she believed I would never attend. I could picture her greeting friends at the door, telling them how important it was to keep the day peaceful and simple. Perhaps she even believed that story herself by now. People often repeat a version of the truth so many times that it begins to feel real. But the quiet folder resting inside my purse held a future she had not imagined. The legal documents were precise and final, written with the careful language that protects decisions from being undone by pressure or persuasion. I pulled into a small parking lot beside a flower shop and turned off the engine. Inside the shop, bright arrangements filled the windows, roses and lilies and spring bouquets wrapped in ribbons. I stepped out of the car and walked inside, choosing a simple bouquet of white tulips. They reminded me of the flowers Daniel once picked from a neighbor's yard when he was 8 years old, proudly presenting them to me with dirt still clinging to the stems. The florist wrapped the tulips in brown paper and wished me a happy Mother's Day as I walked back outside. I placed the bouquet carefully on the passenger seat and sat down behind the wheel again. Across town, a celebration was already beginning, built on the assumption that I had accepted my place outside the door. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands the entire story long before anyone else does. I placed the bouquet of white tulips gently on the passenger seat and started the engine again, letting the car idle for a moment while the quiet hum filled the space around me. The brown paper around the flowers rustled softly every time the air from the vents moved across them, and for a brief second I remembered how Daniel used to bring me wildflowers he found along the sidewalk when he was a child. They were never arranged neatly. Sometimes they were nothing more than dandelions and small yellow weeds, but he always handed them to me with a proud smile that made them feel more valuable than anything sold in a store. I pulled out of the parking lot and continued driving across town, following the familiar streets that slowly shifted from the older neighborhoods into the newer development where Daniel and Vanessa had bought their house 2 years earlier. The houses there were larger, but somehow less personal, each one built with the same clean lines and pale siding that made the entire block look like it had been copied and pasted again and again. As I turned onto their street, I noticed the row of cars already parked along the curb. It looked like Vanessa had invited quite a few guests for her Mother's Day brunch. I slowed the car slightly as I passed their driveway. Through the open garage door, I could see a folding table set with trays of food and a group of people standing nearby talking and laughing. Someone had hung a banner above the front porch that read Happy Mother's Day in bright pink letters. The house looked cheerful and welcoming, exactly the way Vanessa liked to present things. I continued driving past without stopping and parked a little farther down the street beneath the shade of a tall oak tree. From there I could still see the house clearly, but I was far enough away that no one would notice me sitting inside the car. I turned off the engine and watched quietly for a few minutes. Guests moved in and out of the front door carrying plates and drinks. I spotted Daniel once as he stepped onto the porch holding a pitcher of iced tea. He looked older than I remembered from the last time we spoke face to face, as if the past few years had added a layer of quiet exhaustion to his expression. For a moment I wondered whether he truly believed the message Vanessa had sent that morning was the right thing to do. Or perhaps he had simply allowed himself to accept it because it was easier than questioning the person standing beside him every day. I picked up the bouquet of tulips and held it in my hands, studying the delicate white petals for a moment before placing the flowers carefully back on the seat. I had not bought them for Vanessa. I had bought them for someone else. My phone buzzed again inside my purse. I opened it and saw a new message from Daniel. It was short, almost hesitant. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. I hope you are having a good morning. I read the sentence slowly, noticing how carefully it avoided mentioning the gathering happening only a few houses away. There was no invitation. No explanation. Just a polite greeting that felt more like a formality than a conversation between a mother and her son. I typed a simple reply. Thank you, Daniel. I hope your day is peaceful. After sending the message, I placed the phone back in my purse and looked once more toward the house. Laughter drifted across the street along with the faint sound of music playing somewhere inside. Vanessa stepped onto the porch carrying a tray of glasses, greeting guests with the confident smile that always appeared when she believed everything was unfolding according to her plan. She looked completely at ease, as if the small decision to exclude me had solved a problem rather than created one. I watched quietly for another minute before opening the car door and stepping out onto the sidewalk. The warm spring air carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming trees, and somewhere a wind chime rang softly from a nearby porch. I did not walk toward the house. Instead, I walked in the opposite direction, down the street and around the corner, where a small public park sat beside a quiet pond. The path there curved beneath tall trees, and wooden benches lined the water's edge. I sat down on one of those benches and placed the bouquet of tulips beside me. Across the pond, a pair of ducks moved slowly through the water, leaving gentle ripples behind them. The park was peaceful, the kind of place where people come to think clearly when the noise of the world becomes too loud. I reached into my purse and removed the folder containing the documents from Mr. Bennett's office. The papers rested calmly in my hands, their meaning steady and unmistakable. Vanessa believed that by closing one door, she had secured the future she wanted. But the truth resting quietly inside that folder would soon show everyone at that celebration that some doors lead to places she would never be able to enter. I sat quietly on the wooden bench beside the pond, the brown folder resting in my lap, while the white tulips lay gently beside me. The park was calm in the soft afternoon light, and the surface of the water moved slowly every time the breeze passed across it. A pair of ducks drifted toward the far side of the pond, leaving small ripples behind them that widened and disappeared as if nothing had disturbed the water at all. Moments like that remind you how peaceful the world can be when people are not trying to control each other's lives. I opened the folder again and looked down at the neatly arranged papers inside. The words were simple but powerful, written with the careful language that makes decisions permanent. My house on Maplewood Street. My savings. Everything I had built over the past 40 years. The trust ensured that those things would be used the way I believed they should be used, not the way someone else might try to claim them. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it for a moment while my thoughts drifted back through the years. I remembered the first time Daniel asked about the house after he married Vanessa. We had been standing in the kitchen late one evening after dinner. Vanessa had already gone home, and Daniel leaned against the counter with a thoughtful look on his face. He asked if I had ever considered selling the house and moving somewhere smaller. He said a place like this might be too much work for one person. At the time I smiled and told him that every creaky floorboard in that house carried a memory, and memories were not something you traded away simply because someone suggested it might be practical. He nodded politely, but there was something distant in his expression that I had not seen before. Later I realized that was the moment when someone else's ideas had already begun shaping his thoughts. The truth is that people rarely change all at once. They change slowly, conversation by conversation, suggestion by suggestion, until one day the person you raised begins repeating words that did not originate from their own heart. A light breeze moved across the pond again, stirring the tulips beside me so that the paper wrapping made a soft sound. I picked up the flowers and turned them gently in my hands, noticing how the sunlight passed through the thin white petals. When Daniel was 10 years old, he once asked me why I liked white flowers so much. I told him they reminded me that quiet things can still be beautiful without needing to shout for attention. He laughed at the time and said flowers do not shout anyway. I smiled at the memory and placed the bouquet back on the bench. Across town, the celebration at Vanessa's house was probably reaching its busiest moment now. Guests would be filling their plates with brunch food and talking about their families. Vanessa would be moving through the rooms greeting everyone with her polished kindness, making sure every detail looked perfect. Perhaps she even believed she had solved a problem by keeping me away. But the truth waiting inside that folder was not about revenge or anger. It was about balance. When you spend your life giving everything you have to raise a child, you eventually learn that love must also protect itself. The decision I made earlier that week was not sudden. It was the result of many quiet observations over many years. Questions about property. Casual remarks about inheritance. The growing distance in Daniel's voice every time Vanessa stood nearby. Those moments formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I checked the time on my phone and saw that the afternoon was moving forward. It was nearly 2 o'clock. Soon the celebration across town would begin winding down. Guests would start gathering their bags and thanking Vanessa for hosting such a lovely gathering. Daniel might walk them to their cars and wave politely as they drove away. And when the house finally grew quiet again, there would still be one conversation waiting that neither of them expected. I stood up slowly from the bench, holding the folder carefully against my side. The tulips remained where they were for a moment before I picked them up again. They had never been meant for Vanessa. They were meant for someone who had spent a lifetime learning that patience often reveals the truth more clearly than confrontation ever could. I walked back toward my car along the narrow path beside the pond, the soft gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The afternoon sun warmed the air around me as I reached the parking lot and opened the car door. Before starting the engine, I looked once more at the folder resting on the seat beside the flowers. Vanessa believed the future of my house, and everything inside it was already decided. But the quiet pages inside that folder told a very different story, one that would soon reach her doorstep whether she invited it or not. I started the car and pulled slowly out of the small parking lot beside the park, the late afternoon sunlight stretching long shadows across the road as I turned back toward the neighborhood where Daniel and Vanessa lived. The white tulips rested quietly on the passenger seat beside the brown folder, and the simple presence of those two things seemed to hold the entire truth of the day between them. The drive across town felt shorter this time, perhaps because the decision that once carried uncertainty had now settled into something steady and clear. When I reached Willow Avenue again, the street looked different from earlier in the day. Several cars that had lined the curb were now gone, leaving wide open spaces where guests had once parked. A few remained near the house, suggesting that the celebration was beginning to wind down the way gatherings always do after people have eaten their fill and shared the same stories twice. I slowed as I approached the familiar driveway. The bright banner still hung above the porch, though one corner had begun to curl slightly in the warm breeze. Through the front windows I could see movement inside the living room. A small group of people stood near the dining table, talking casually while someone gathered empty plates. I parked the car along the curb and turned off the engine, sitting quietly for a moment while I looked toward the house where my son now lived. The windows reflected the sky so clearly that it was difficult to see inside unless someone moved close to the glass. For a brief second, I remembered another house long ago, a small apartment where Daniel and I used to celebrate Mother's Day with nothing more than pancakes and a paper card he made in school. Life had been simpler then. But simplicity is something people often trade away without realizing how valuable it was. I picked up the bouquet of tulips and stepped out of the car, closing the door gently behind me. The sidewalk felt warm beneath my shoes as I walked toward the front gate. Laughter drifted faintly from the backyard, where several guests were still gathered near the patio. I could hear Vanessa's voice among them, light and confident as she thanked someone for coming. She had always been good at sounding gracious when other people were listening. I walked slowly up the front path, noticing the small details she had arranged for the day. Flower pots lined the porch steps. A decorative wreath hung on the door with a ribbon that read Mother's Day blessings. Everything looked thoughtful and welcoming, the way people design celebrations when they want photographs to capture a perfect moment. For a brief moment, I wondered how many of those guests believed the story Vanessa had likely told about why I was not there. Perhaps she said I was resting. Perhaps she explained that I preferred quiet mornings at home. The truth was often replaced by simpler explanations that allowed everyone to continue smiling. I reached the porch and stood there for a moment, holding the tulips in one hand while the folder rested securely under my arm. Through the window beside the door, I could see Daniel inside the living room speaking with an older couple I recognized from his workplace. His shoulders looked tense, the way they did when something weighed on his mind even if he did not say it aloud. I wondered if my brief message earlier had stayed with him longer than he expected. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom." The words had been polite, but they carried a distance that had grown slowly over the years. I lifted my hand and knocked gently on the door. The sound was soft, but clear. Inside the living room, Daniel turned his head toward the door almost immediately, as if he had been expecting someone else to arrive. When he opened it and saw me standing there on the porch, the surprise in his expression was impossible to hide. "Mom," he said quietly, the word leaving his mouth as though it had been waiting there all day. I offered him a calm smile and held the bouquet of tulips slightly forward. "Happy Mother's Day to you as well, Daniel," I said softly. The room behind him grew very still as several people noticed who stood at the door. Conversations paused. A chair scraped lightly across the floor. Somewhere in the backyard, someone called Vanessa's name without realizing that the moment unfolding inside the house had already begun to change the direction of the entire afternoon. I stepped across the threshold slowly, the folder still resting securely against my side, carrying with me the quiet certainty that the truth rarely needs to raise its voice in order to be heard. Daniel stood frozen for a moment after I stepped inside, as if his mind was still trying to understand how the quiet plan of the day had suddenly changed. The living room behind him had fallen into an unusual silence. A few guests who had been talking near the dining table now watched with polite curiosity, unsure whether to continue their conversations or pretend they had not noticed anything unusual. I handed the bouquet of white tulips to Daniel, and he accepted them almost automatically, glancing down at the flowers before looking back at me. "Thank you for coming," he said carefully, though his voice carried the uncertain tone of someone who had not expected this moment to happen at all. I offered a calm smile and stepped farther into the room, my eyes moving slowly across the space that Vanessa had decorated so carefully for the celebration. The dining table was still covered with plates, small bowls of fruit, and the remains of a large brunch spread that had clearly been prepared with effort. A few empty glasses stood near the edge of the table where guests had recently been standing. Everything looked warm and inviting, the way a home appears when people want it to feel perfect for the outside world. From the hallway I heard footsteps approaching quickly, followed by the familiar voice that had sent me the message earlier that morning. Vanessa appeared in the doorway with a bright smile that faded the moment she saw me standing beside Daniel. For a brief second her expression struggled to decide whether to remain polite or shift into something less welcoming. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said finally, her tone smooth but slightly tight, "I did not realize you were coming today." I nodded gently and looked at her. With the same calm expression I had carried all afternoon. "I was nearby," I said simply, "and I thought it would be nice to stop by and wish everyone a happy Mother's Day in person." A few of the guests exchanged quiet glances as the room settled into an uncomfortable pause. Vanessa stepped forward, her smile returning in a slightly firmer shape as if she had quickly decided that maintaining control of the situation required confidence. "Of course," she replied, "you are always welcome to visit briefly. We were just finishing up." The sentence was polite, but the meaning behind it was clear enough. I rested the brown folder gently on the dining table and placed my hand on top of it. "I will not stay long," I said calmly. "I only came to give Daniel something important." Daniel looked down at the folder with a puzzled expression, while Vanessa's eyes moved toward it almost immediately with a flicker of curiosity that she tried to hide. "What is it, Mom?" Daniel asked quietly. I opened the folder slowly and removed the neatly prepared documents inside. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the backyard, where a few guests had not yet realized the mood inside the house had changed. I turned the top page toward Daniel so he could read the title printed clearly across the paper. It explained the legal trust and the updated will that Mr. Bennett had prepared earlier that week. Daniel read the words carefully, his eyebrows drawing together as the meaning began to settle in. Vanessa stepped closer to look over his shoulder, the confident expression she had worn earlier beginning to fade as she realized what the document described. I spoke quietly so that everyone in the room could hear without any need to raise my voice. "Earlier this week I decided to organize my estate in a way that protects the house on Maplewood Street and everything connected to it," I explained. "The trust ensures that the property will be used exactly the way I believe it should be used in the future." Daniel looked up from the page, confusion and concern mixing in his eyes. "Mom, you did not need to do this today," he said softly. I reached out and touched his arm gently. "This is not about today, Daniel," I replied. "It is about making sure that the things I built over a lifetime remain in the hands of people who value them for the right reasons." Vanessa remained very still beside him, her eyes scanning the document again, as if searching for a detail she had not yet understood. The room behind us stayed quiet while the meaning of the papers slowly unfolded in the minds of everyone present. And for the first time since I stepped through the door, the confident certainty that had guided Vanessa all morning was replaced by the realization that the future she had quietly imagined was not the one that had been written on those pages. For several long seconds Daniel did not say anything. He continued staring at the document as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Vanessa stood beside him, her posture suddenly rigid, her confident smile completely gone now. Around the dining table the remaining guests had grown very quiet, each of them pretending to look at something else while clearly listening to every word being spoken. Daniel finally lifted his eyes from the paper and looked at me with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Mom, he said slowly, this is the house is going into a charitable housing trust. I nodded calmly. That is correct, Daniel. The property will remain in the trust and will eventually become transitional housing for widowed women in our county. The legal arrangement ensures the house will always serve that purpose. Vanessa blinked several times as if she had misheard something important. Her voice came out sharper than she intended when she finally spoke. I do not understand, she said, looking between Daniel and me. I thought the house was going to stay in the family. I folded my hands gently in front of me and met her gaze without raising my voice. It will stay connected to the values I believe a family should represent, I replied quietly. Security, compassion, and dignity for people who have spent years caring for others and suddenly find themselves alone. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, clearly trying to process the information while standing in front of several curious guests. But Mom, he said carefully, you never mentioned anything like this before. I offered him a soft smile, the kind a mother gives when she understands something her child has not yet seen clearly. Sometimes decisions grow slowly over time, Daniel. They form after many conversations and many quiet observations. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Vanessa glanced again at the papers, as if hoping there was some small line she had overlooked. But the legal language was clear. The trust controlled the property. No individual ownership would pass through inheritance. Everything was organized to support the program Mr. Bennett and I had discussed earlier that week. I gently closed the folder and slid it back across the table toward Daniel. The documents inside were copies for him to keep so that he would understand what had been arranged. The original signed version was already safely filed with the attorney. Daniel looked down at the folder but did not pick it up immediately. His shoulders had lowered slightly, the way they do when a person realizes something important has shifted beyond their control. I placed my hand briefly on his arm again. This does not change the fact that you are my son, I said quietly. Nothing will ever change that. But a home is more than walls and a roof. It represents the values that shaped the people who lived inside it. And those values deserve protection too. Vanessa said nothing this time. She simply stepped back a half step, her eyes moving toward the front window where the afternoon light was beginning to soften into early evening. Outside, the quiet neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had that morning when the celebration began. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life continued forward in its steady rhythm. I turned toward the door and picked up my purse from the chair near the entrance. Thank you for letting me stop by, I said politely to the room. I hope everyone enjoyed the celebration. One of the older guests nodded kindly, clearly unsure how to respond, but sensing that the moment carried more meaning than a simple family visit. Daniel walked with me to the door while holding the folder carefully in his hands. Mom, he said quietly as we reached the porch, I did not know Vanessa sent that message this morning. I looked at him for a moment, seeing the same boy who once asked why white flowers were my favorite. I believe you, Daniel, I replied. Softly. But sometimes the way people speak around us slowly changes the things we believe are acceptable. That is why it is important to remember who we were before those voices arrived. He nodded slowly, still absorbing everything that had happened. I stepped down from the porch and walked toward my car, the evening air now cooler than it had been earlier in the afternoon. Behind me the house remained quiet, as if the celebration inside had paused to reconsider what the word family truly meant. And as I opened the car door and looked once more at the calm street around me, I realized something simple and certain. The future of my home was no longer a question anyone else could quietly plan for. It had already been written by the only person who had spent a lifetime building it.